The last morning Martin Voss ever spent at the lake, he stood at the water's edge and counted the rings a single pebble made. He had thrown the pebble himself, a flat gray oval he'd picked from the mud near the dock, the kind with one smooth face and one rough. And he watched those circles expand outward until they reached the reeds and vanished, absorbed without ceremony into the water that had absorbed everything else about his life. He counted 7 rings. He always counted. It was a habit from the years when counting was all he had left. Counting days, counting pages, counting the footsteps between his cabin and the research station so he wouldn't have to think about what waited inside. That morning the lake was still. Not peacefully still, the way lakes are still in photographs meant to sell something, calm and luminous and fake. It was still the way a room goes still when someone has just said something that cannot be unsaid. The surrounding forest pressed in from 3 sides, dark even in August, the spruce trees old enough to have witnessed things that had nothing to do with him. The 4th side was open sky, a gray-white strip of it above the opposite shore, and somewhere beneath that sky, 32 kilometers away through the pines, was the town of Skarvik. And in Skarvik, the symposium had already begun. Martin didn't know that yet. He would find out in 4 hours and 11 minutes, when his phone buzzed against the wooden table inside the cabin with a message from a number he didn't recognize. But right now, at the water's edge, he was only 63 years old and almost entirely at peace, which was something he had not been able to say about himself for most of the preceding decade. He was a tall man, though he'd stopped standing fully upright in his 50s, the way tall men often do when the world stops asking them to be impressive. His hair had gone white while he was still in his 40s. Stress, his doctor said, which was a polite way of saying loss. And by now, it suited him, blended with his complexion in the flat northern light. He wore the same canvas shirt he'd worn every August for 15 years, a faded olive green that his daughter Signa had once told him smelled like the lake, even after it was washed. He had taken that as a compliment. He wasn't sure she'd meant it as one. He had come to the lake this particular summer for the same reason he came every summer, because it was the only place on Earth where no one needed anything from him. The cabin belonged to him, truly belonged to him, one of the very few things that did, because he had bought it with money earned before the project, before the institute, before everything that had unraveled so slowly he hadn't noticed until it was completely gone. 2 rooms, a fireplace, a dock that needed replacing every 3rd year, and 20 meters of shoreline on the western edge of Lake Graven. No neighbors visible, no neighbors audible. Just the water and the forest, and the soft, insistent percussion of the woodpecker who lived in the dead birch at the cabin's northeast corner, and who, for reasons Martin had never determined, began working precisely at 7:45 every morning and stopped at 8. The woodpecker was working now. Martin listened to it without turning around. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the far shore, and he was thinking about the climate model. Not the current one, not the one everyone was citing in papers now, but the original one. The one he had built in the 22 years between 1989 and 2011 in the basement laboratory of the Graven Institute for Environmental Research. The one that was, in every meaningful scientific sense, the foundation upon which every subsequent version had been constructed. The one that bore other people's names. He did not think about this angrily. That was the thing people never quite understood about him, the few people who knew enough to understand anything at all. He had moved past anger so long ago that he could barely remember what it had felt like. What remained was something quieter and more durable, a kind of factual melancholy, the way you might feel about a beautiful building that had been renovated past recognition. You could acknowledge it had happened. You could even appreciate what the building had become. What you couldn't do was pretend the original architect had never existed. His phone buzzed at 11:23 in the morning. He was inside by then, making coffee on the small gas stove, watching the forest through the kitchen window. The woodpecker had long since finished. The lake, visible from this window at an oblique angle, was beginning to develop a slight chop from the west wind that always came in the late morning in August. And the quality of light had shifted from the flat gray of early morning to something more silver, more alive. He looked at his phone. The message was from a number with a Skarvik area code that he did not have saved. It said, "You should watch this. It's happening now." Below the words was a link. Martin set down his coffee. He looked at the link for a moment. He had spent a long time learning to be suspicious of things that arrived uninvited, and this had the particular shape of something that would cost him something, the way an envelope with no return address always costs you something even before you open it. But he clicked the link. Because he was 63 years old, and he had learned, very slowly and at great personal expense, that refusing to look at things did not make them not exist. The link opened a streaming page. It was a live broadcast, labeled in small text at the top as the Skarvik Regional Climate Symposium Annual Address. And what was happening on the screen, in a large auditorium that Martin recognized immediately because he had helped design its seating arrangement in 1997, was a woman he had not spoken to in 11 years, standing at a podium in front of 400 people and describing, in careful, measured academic language, the theoretical framework that Martin Voss had spent the better part of 3 decades building. Her name was Dr. Astrid Helle. She was 58 years old, and she had been, for 11 of the last 22 years, the director of the Graven Institute. Her name was on the model. Her name was, in fact, on most of the things Martin had built, had been for longer than he liked to calculate, beginning not with malice, but with the kind of small accommodations that look reasonable in the moment and only reveal their true nature when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of them. Martin stood in his kitchen and watched. He did not make a sound. What Astrid Helle was describing to the symposium was the Helle-Graven Predictive Climate Framework, which she had published under that name in 2012, 1 year after Martin's contract at the Institute had not been renewed. She was describing its genesis, its conceptual origins, she called them. The theoretical leap, she said, that had been necessary to move from correlative climate modeling to genuinely predictive frameworks. She spoke with the particular confidence of someone who had repeated a story so many times it had become indistinguishable from memory. She cited papers. She cited collaborators. She cited, with a small nostalgic smile that Martin recognized from faculty meetings of 20 years ago, the difficult early years of the project. She did not mention Martin Voss. The symposium had an audience of journalists. Martin could tell from the way the camera panned, slowly, approvingly, the way cameras pan across authority, that this was not a minor event. And he understood, watching from his kitchen in the cabin with the chop picking up on the lake behind him, that something was being consolidated here. That Astrid Helle was not simply giving a lecture. She was giving a lecture that would be recorded, indexed, cited, and referenced for the next 20 years in every paper that touched the framework. She was, in the most elegant and complete way possible, writing him out of a story he had spent his life writing. He put down his phone. He picked up his coffee. He walked back outside to the dock and stood there for a long time, watching the water. The lake made no noise that was useful to him. The west wind moved the surface into small, regular furrows, and the furrows caught the silver light and threw it sideways. The spruce trees on the north shore were swaying, collectively, in a slow rhythm that had nothing to do with anything he felt. He had been erased before. He understood that now with a clarity that only comes after many years of careful and honest thinking. But never so publicly, and never with such precision. The previous erasures had been incremental. A paper drafted by him, submitted under her name. A presentation given with his slides, his data, his careful arguments from which he had been absent. A grant application in which he appeared in the acknowledgments section as additional research support. Each small, each, at the time, accompanied by an explanation that made a certain kind of sense. The first time had been in 1998. They had been colleagues for 6 years, collaborators for 4, and the paper in question, a 40-page analysis of thermal stratification data from 12 Nordic lakes, including Lake Graven itself, had been entirely his. He had written every word, generated every graph, conducted 3 of the 4 field seasons of data collection alone. Astrid had been listed as first author because, she'd explained, the journal had a relationship with her department. Because first authorship would help her tenure case, which was still in progress, while his was already secure. Because, and this was the part that had sounded most reasonable and cost the most in the long run, they would collaborate on the response paper, and he would be first author there. The response paper never happened. The next paper happened, and the one after that. And by the time Martin had understood the geometry of the situation, which was in 2003, when he found his name had been removed from a grant application he'd helped draft because, Astrid explained, the funding body had concerns about the size of the team. By that time, the pattern was so thoroughly established that dismantling it would have required him to unmake choices that had calcified into the record. To dispute authorship on a paper that had been cited 47 times. To claim credit for work that had been attributed elsewhere in the literature. To become, in other words, the kind of person who makes scenes. Martin Voss had never made scenes. It was, he had come to understand, the central fact of his professional biography, and it had cost him more than any other single characteristic. He was the kind of man who believed, with a sincerity that bordered on the theological, that good work would eventually speak for itself, that the truth did not need an advocate, that the record, given enough time, would correct itself. He had been wrong about all of it. Or not wrong exactly, because the truth did not disappear. It was simply outpaced. The record did not correct itself, because no one was looking at the record. What mattered was the story, and the story belonged to whoever told it most often and most confidently, and to the most people. And that was not him. He stood on the dock for a long time. Then he went inside and opened his laptop. He wasn't sure when he opened it what he intended to do. He had a folder. He had always had a folder. A habit begun in 1999 when something in him had recognized the shape of what was happening, even as he convinced himself otherwise. The folder contained emails. It contained draft documents with metadata intact, showing creation dates and authorship. It contained lab notebooks photographed on his phone, the physical notebooks sitting in a climate-controlled box in his daughter Signa's garage in Trondheim, where they had lived for 11 years in patient silence. He had added to the folder over the years the way you add to an insurance policy, without any clear intention of ever using it, simply because not having it felt irresponsible. He looked at the folder. Then he closed the laptop without opening it. Because what he was feeling right now, and he was honest enough with himself to identify the feeling accurately, was not anger. It was close to anger, touching anger the way the lake touched the dock, present against it, but not the same thing. What it actually was, he thought, was exhaustion. A very old and very deep exhaustion that had lived in him for so long it had taken on the character of something structural, like a beam in a house that had settled and warped until the house was built around its wrongness. He was tired of the calculation. Tired of measuring the distance between what had happened and what was recorded as having happened. Tired of carrying the weight of a truth that no one had asked him to carry. He made more coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. Outside, the west wind was picking up, and the chop on the lake had deepened into actual small waves, and the silver light had flattened back toward gray. What he did not know, could not know, sitting there in the cabin with his coffee growing cold, was that 316 kilometers to the south, in the city of Bergen, a man named Einar Vold was watching the same live stream from a very different kind of chair. Einar Vold was 44 years old. He had been, for 3 years, an investigative journalist at a national newspaper. Before that, he had been other things: a science writer, a researcher, briefly a doctoral student in environmental science at a university that no longer existed under that name. The reason he had not completed his doctorate was complex and involved several decisions made under conditions of considerable pressure. And the reason he was watching the Skarvik Symposium livestream from his home office was that he had been, for the past 8 months, very quietly investigating the Graven Institute. He had not been investigating Martin Voss. He had not, in fact, known who Martin Voss was until 6 months into his investigation, when he found the name in a document he was not supposed to have, in the course of searching for something else entirely. What Einar Vold was investigating was grant fraud, specifically a pattern of grant applications submitted by the Graven Institute between 2005 and 2019, in which the Institute had, on numerous occasions, claimed credit for methodological innovations that the documentation trail suggested had originated elsewhere. It was a bureaucratic story, the kind that lived in spreadsheets and committee minutes, and it had come to him through a source inside the Ministry of Research and Innovation who had found the pattern anomalous and had no other avenue for raising it. Einar had been following the money, specifically the way a series of major EU research grants had been awarded to the Institute on the basis of the Hella Graven framework's novelty. Novelty that the underlying documentation suggested was not quite as novel as represented. He had the documents. He had, over 8 months of careful work, assembled a timeline. What he had not had, until he found Martin Voss's name in a 2002 personnel file with an attached note in Astrid Hella's handwriting that read, "Primary architect, not for external communication," was a human story. And what he now had, watching Astrid Hella at the Skarvik podium, was a human story that was also in the process of becoming a bigger story, in real time, on a live stream, in front of 400 people. He picked up his phone. He found, through 3 degrees of professional connection, a phone number. He sent the text with the link and the words, "You should watch this. It's happening now." He did not know whether Martin Voss would respond. He had, in 8 months of investigation, encountered the name without encountering the man. And what he knew of the man suggested someone who had, long ago, decided that the cost of speaking was higher than the cost of silence. Einar understood this calculation better than most people might have expected, for reasons he had never discussed with anyone professionally. He sat and watched the live stream and waited. Martin called back 40 minutes later. The voice, when Einar answered, was careful, not hostile. Careful. The way a person is careful when they have spent a long time learning to be careful, and the habit has become a form of protection they are reluctant to lower. "Who are you?" Martin said. Not asked, said. Einar told him. He gave his name, his publication, his general subject of investigation. He did not, at this point, give specifics. He had learned, in 3 years of investigative work, that the first conversation was not for specifics. It was for taking the temperature of something. Martin said nothing for a moment. In the background, Einar could hear what sounded like wind. An outdoor sound. Water, perhaps. "What do you want?" Martin said. "To understand what happened," Einar said. Another pause, then, "That's a large question." "I have documentation," Einar said. "From the Institute, from grant applications, from the Ministry. I have a timeline." He paused. "But I don't have your side of it." Martin Voss was quiet for so long that Einar checked his phone screen to confirm the call was still connected. "Why now?" Martin finally said. Einar told him about the live stream, about the symposium, about the fact that in approximately 4 hours, the recording would be indexed on the Institute's website, and the framing Astrid Helle had provided, the origin story she had delivered to 400 journalists and academics, would become the canonical version, that it would be cited, that the window, if there was a window, was not large. Martin said, "I'll need to think about it." "Of course," Einar said. "How long do you have?" "The symposium ends Friday. If we're going to have a conversation that matters before she files the keynote as official Institute record, it needs to happen before then." Another pause. The wind sound. "I'll call you tomorrow," Martin said. He did not call the next day. He called that evening, at 7:43, 2 minutes before the woodpecker and the dead birch typically stopped working for the day. He had spent the intervening hours doing something he had not done in years, which was going through the folder. The folder was larger than he remembered. He had been adding to it for so long, so reflexively, that he had stopped registering what it contained. But now, going through it with the specific intention of understanding its shape, sitting at the kitchen table with the laptop open and the light outside going gold, and then gray, and then the deep, specific blue of a northern August evening, he understood that what he had was not simply documentation. What he had was, if assembled correctly, a complete reconstruction of how something had been taken from him, piece by piece, over 2 decades, by someone who had known him well enough to know exactly what he would and would not endure. The oldest document in the folder was from 1997. It was a draft of the first paper they had submitted together, the one about thermohaline circulation in freshwater systems that had been Martin's idea, Martin's methodology, Martin's 3 years of field data. He had drafted it over a winter. The draft had his name as sole author. The published version, which appeared 8 months later, had Astrid's name first. He read his own handwriting in the 1997 draft, the technical language he had used when he was 36 years old, and still believed, completely, that work was its own argument. Then he read the email chain from the submission process, the quiet negotiation, the exchange in which Astrid had explained with perfect reasonableness that the journal's editor was a personal contact, that this would help move the review process, that she would, going forward, make sure the credit balance evened out. Going forward. The credit balance. He read 23 years of emails in which those phrases, or variations of them, appeared a total of 31 times. He had said yes 31 times. He sat with that for a while. The thing he had never let himself fully think. The thing he had kept in the folder along with the documents but had never opened. Had treated as a file within a file that might detonate if examined, was the question of why. Not why Astrid had done it. He understood that well enough. But why he had allowed it. Why he had said yes the 2nd time, and the 10th time, and the 23rd time. Why, when a voice in him had known from very early what the shape of the thing was, he had continued. It was the lake, he thought, in the way that thoughts come when you're not trying to have them. It was this place. He had grown up 200 kilometers north of this lake, in a small fishing community where his father had worked the same stretch of water for 40 years without complaint. And the virtue that was modeled for him, the one he had absorbed so thoroughly it had become invisible, was that you did not speak the size of your contribution. You did the work. The work spoke. And if the work did not speak loudly enough, you did more work. He had done more work. He had done enormous amounts of work. He had, across 22 years, produced the foundational body of research from which the Halle-Graven framework had been constructed, and he had done it largely alone, in a basement laboratory With equipment he had partly sourced himself, while Astrid had managed the politics of the Institute with a competence he had genuinely admired, and still, if he was honest, admired in a certain cold way. She had been good at it. The management of credit is itself a skill, and she had exercised it with real sophistication. What she had not understood, or perhaps what she had understood perfectly well and had simply declined to let matter, was that there were limits to what a person could absorb. That a person could say yes to being erased incrementally for 23 years and still be, at the center of themselves, entirely present, still carrying the full weight of what had been built and what had been taken. He called Einar Vold at 7:43. The conversation lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. Martin talked. Einar listened. There were long silences, and Martin did not fill them. He spoke about the science, the framework, its origins, the theoretical problem it had solved, why it had mattered, what it had made possible, and he spoke with a precision and a contained passion that Einar, who had interviewed hundreds of scientists, recognized as the sound of someone who had loved something for a very long time without being allowed to claim it publicly. He did not speak about Astrid with bitterness. He spoke about her with something more like clinical accuracy. He described decisions. He described exchanges. He was careful to distinguish between what he knew and what he inferred. He mentioned the folder. He did not offer to share its contents, not yet, and Einar did not push. At the end of the conversation, Einar said, "I want to be honest with you about something." "Go ahead," Martin said. "I started this investigation for reasons that weren't about you. I was following grant money. I am still following grant money." He paused. "But the story I found is your story. And I think, if the documentation holds, and based on what you've described, I believe it does, I think what happened to you is the reason the grant irregularities were possible. They needed your work to be unattributed for the applications to make sense. You were the gap that made the fraud possible." A long silence. The wind outside Einar's window. The wind outside Martin's. "I see," Martin said. "You were erased," Einar said. "Partly for aesthetic reasons, credit, priority, professional prestige, but also for structural ones. The story required you to not exist." Martin did not respond for almost a minute. Then, "I know that. I think you've known it for a long time." "Yes." "And you didn't act on it?" "No." "Why?" Einar said, not aggressively, with genuine curiosity. Martin looked out the kitchen window at the lake. The light was gone now, the water invisible, only the sound of it in the wind. "Because I told myself the truth didn't need me to protect it," he said, "that it would hold its own weight." He heard Einar exhale slowly on the other end of the line. "That's a kind of faith," Einar said. "It's a kind of cowardice," Martin said. "I know the difference. I've had 20 years to learn it." They arranged to meet in Skarvik on Thursday, 2 days away. Einar would bring the documentation he had. Martin would bring what he had. They would see what the combined picture looked like. They would, Einar said, go slowly. They would be careful. No decisions until they had both seen everything. After he hung up, Martin sat at the table for a while. Then he put on his jacket and went down to the dock. The lake at night was different from the lake in the day, in ways that went beyond the obvious. In the day it was a specific thing, a body of water with a particular color and depth and history, a place he had named in papers and measured in meters, and watched change with the seasons across 30 years of careful attention. At night, it became something older and less interested in specifics. It was just water. And water was what it had always been before there were instruments to measure it with. It reflected nothing now but the faint glow of the sky, which at this latitude in August never went fully dark. He stood on the dock. He had not made a decision, he told himself. He had had a conversation. The conversation had revealed some things. The decision, whether to participate, whether to open the folder, whether to become the kind of person who unmakes choices that had long ago calcified into the record, that was still ahead of him. He was 63 years old. He had a cabin on a lake. He had a daughter in Trondheim who called on Sundays and who had, over the years, developed a careful agnosticism about his professional life that he recognized as love in the form of restraint. He had, it had to be said, a kind of peace here that he did not have anywhere else, and the peace was predicated, at least in part, on not asking certain questions. He threw a pebble in the lake. He watched the rings. In the dark, he couldn't count them. The drive to Skarvik took 40 minutes on a road that ran alongside the lake for the first 12 kilometers before turning inland through forest. Martin made it on Thursday morning without music, which was unusual for him. He normally played radio on the drive because the silence of the car without it was a particular kind of silence he found uncomfortable, the silence of being alone with a decision. But today he drove without the radio and let the silence be what it was, which was the sound of 32 kilometers of his life running backward. He had passed this road in both directions many times. The road had looked different each time, depending on what he was carrying. He remembered the direction from the Institute to the lake in the years when the work was good. 1994, 1997, 2001. When he drove outward with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition and everything to do with having understood something true about the world. Those drives had felt like release. He remembered the direction from the lake to the Institute in 2009, when he had begun to understand clearly that the project was not going to credit him, and when his decision, clearly made over a winter in the cabin, had been to continue anyway, because the work mattered more than the accounting. He had made peace with that decision. He had then spent 4 years making peace with it again, every time the accounting required him to pretend that peace was sufficient. It had not been sufficient, but it had been what he had. Skarvik was a small city, the kind that describes itself as a cultural center in the way small cities do when they mean they have 1 good concert hall and 3 decent restaurants. The symposium was being held in the Civic Auditorium near the waterfront, the same auditorium where Martin had attended in a previous chapter of his life. A retirement dinner for a colleague whose name he now found he couldn't recall without effort. The symposium itself was winding down. The keynote address was already recorded, already uploaded to the Institute website that morning, already receiving the first wave of professional commentary on the relevant academic networks. Martin had looked at the commentary. He had read, in the flat morning light of his cabin, before packing his bag. The language people had used to describe what Astrid had presented. Groundbreaking was a word that appeared several times. Foundational. A career-defining contribution. Her gift to the field. He had read these words with the same attention he gave to lab data, neutrally, precisely, noting what they revealed about the system that produced them. The system that produced them was a system in which he did not exist. He met Einar at a cafe near the auditorium at 10 in the morning. Einar was younger than Martin had expected, younger looking rather, with the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent 8 months paying close attention to something that did not want to be looked at. He was compact and quiet, and he shook Martin's hand with the grip of someone who had decided before the meeting how this was going to go. Martin respected that. He had been like that himself, once. They sat at a corner table. Einar had a laptop and a folder. Martin had the folder from his bag, printed. He had printed the most important elements in the cabin the night before, because he wanted to be able to put them on a table and look at them with his hands, not through a screen. The smell of the coffee was dark and strong, and somewhere outside, through the cafe window, the harbor was doing what harbors do in August, which is to say, It was receiving small boats and reflecting a sky that had decided to be blue for the occasion. Einar spread his documentation. Martin looked at it. The grant applications were thorough. Einar had 14 of them, spanning 2006 to 2019, all submitted to EU research bodies, all claiming the Hellegraven framework as the Institute's primary methodological contribution. The applications were written with the care of documents meant to be believed, which is a different kind of care from the kind meant to be accurate. They described the framework's development in language that was technically true in every specific, while being systemically false in overall shape. The way a biography that lists only certain facts can be more dishonest than a biography that lists none. Martin recognized the language. He recognized, more than he wanted to, the rhythm of the sentences in several sections, because the rhythm was his, from documents he had drafted, processed through Astrid's editing, in the way all things in her hands were processed, which was efficiently and without acknowledgement of their origin. "She's a good writer," Martin said, without entirely meaning to. Einar looked up. "She's thorough." "No." Martin shook his head. "That's not what I mean. I mean she understands language the way she understands everything, as a set of tools. She uses them well." He set down the grant application he had been reading. Outside, through the harbor window, a boat was coming in with a small sail, the red and white kind that old wooden boats in this part of the country often flew, and watching it, Martin felt something shift in him that he recognized from childhood as the feeling that precedes crying, though he had not cried in professional contexts since his mother died, and this did not seem like an appropriate occasion to start. He told Einar about 1997. He told him about the paper, the specific paper, the one about thermohaline circulation, the one that had the metadata on the draft that showed Martin as sole author and the publication date 8 months later with Astrid first. He walked Einar through the email chain. He was specific about dates. He was specific about language. He did not editorialize. Einar listened and took notes. After a while, Martin ran out of specifics about 1997 and moved to 1999, and then to 2002, and then to 2005, which was when the pattern had become, in retrospect, irreversible. The year the framework had first been named with Astrid's name in a presentation to the Nordic Climate Consortium, presented by Astrid to an audience of 200 that had not included Martin, because he had been conducting fieldwork that week that could not be postponed. Fieldwork that had generated 3 of the key datasets referenced in that presentation. "Did you know about the presentation beforehand?" Einar asked. "I knew there was a presentation," Martin said. "I didn't know it would be framed the way it was." "Did you ask to see the slides?" "She said she would handle it." He paused. "I trusted her." The words landed in the air between them with a particular weight that both men seemed to find uncomfortable for different reasons. "You trusted her," Einar said, "for a very long time." Martin looked at his hands on the table. They were the hands of a man who had spent 30 years in boats and laboratories and the occasional cold field station, and they showed it. She was I don't know what the word is, not a mentor, a peer who I looked up to in certain ways. She understood the institutional landscape better than I did. I was good at the science, she was good at the rest of it. We complemented each other, for a while. And then we complemented each other in a way that stopped being equitable. He said it plainly, without inflection. Little by little, each step made sense. Each step had a reason. By the time I understood what the steps added up to, I was already outside of it. Einar asked, "Did she know what she was doing? From the beginning?" This was the question Martin had been asking himself, in various forms, for 20 years. He had answers that were honest and answers that were simpler, and at this particular table, With the grant applications spread between them and the harbor beyond the window, he thought he owed both of them the honest one. "I think," he said slowly, "that she didn't. Not at the beginning. At the beginning, she was a young academic making choices that advanced her career, the way young academics do. Because academia is a system that rewards exactly those choices and punishes exactly my kind of choices. She was not unusual. She was simply good at something I was bad at." He paused. "But I think there came a point, somewhere in the early 2000s, I believe, though I can't be certain, when she did know. When she had been making those choices long enough that she understood their cumulative effect. And she kept making them. And that's different." Einar was quiet. "The first kind," Martin said, "is a failure of attention. The second kind is a choice." He looked at the table. "I think she made both kinds. In that order." They talked through lunch, which arrived at the table without either of them having exactly ordered it. The waitress seemed to understand that the two men at the corner table with the papers would need food at some point, and had acted on that understanding with a generosity that Martin appreciated. He ate without tasting. He was not thinking about eating. He was thinking about the question Einar had not asked yet, which was the question that would determine whether this conversation became anything more than a conversation. The question of what Martin wanted, what he was willing to do. Whether at 63, sitting in a cafe in the town adjacent to the lake where he had spent the last 30 years, building and losing something, he was willing to become the person who makes scenes. Einar asked it after they had eaten, when the papers were back in their respective folders and the coffee was being refreshed. He asked it without preamble. "What do you want to happen?" Martin looked at him. "I don't want anything to happen to her." Einar waited. "I mean that specifically," Martin said. "I don't want her punished. I don't want her career destroyed. I am 63 years old, and I have been carrying this for a long time. And what I have learned from carrying it is that the desire to see someone else suffer because of what they've taken from you is a kind of poverty. It keeps you as poor as the original loss." "Okay," Einar said. "Then what do you want?" Martin was quiet for a moment. Outside, the harbor light was doing the thing it does in the early afternoon in high summer, which is to become genuinely golden in a way that feels almost staged, as though the world is trying to make a point. "I want the record to reflect what happened," he said, "not what was performed. What happened." He looked at his hands again. "I want the work to have its name." The conversation they had after that was about process, about what kind of documentation Einar would need for the story he was writing, about the distinction between the grant fraud inquiry, which was a separate matter involving the ministry, involving potential financial irregularities, and the question of attribution, about how the story would be framed, which Martin said twice that he did not want to control, would not attempt to control, because he had spent too long watching the damage that controlling narratives caused. He would give Einar everything he had, and trust Einar's judgment, which he recognized was itself a form of the same faith he had always placed in things he could not manage. Einar said, "There's something I need to tell you." Martin looked at him. "I told you I started this investigation for reasons that weren't about you. That's true." He paused. "But it's not entirely coincidental that I found you." Martin waited. "I did my doctoral work," Einar said, "at the Institute, from 2004 to 2007, before I left." He looked at the table. "I left because I found, in my third year, that a substantial part of my dissertation methodology had been incorporated into an internal institute research paper without my knowledge. I was not listed as a contributor. When I raised it with the director, with Astrid Helle, I was told the parallel development was coincidental, that my methodology, while promising, was insufficiently distinct from existing approaches to constitute original contribution. He said it flatly, without the particular weight that would have indicated it was meant to land as something. Martin looked at him for a long time. "How old were you?" Martin said. 27. "And what did you do?" "I left," Einar said simply. "I told myself I was leaving because I preferred journalism, that the academic environment wasn't for me." He paused. "I believed that for a long time." "Do you believe it now?" "I believe I prefer journalism," Einar said. "I believe that's true. But I don't believe it was why I left." Martin looked out the window. The golden light on the harbor. The small boat with the red sail, tied up now at the far dock, its mast moving gently in the afternoon wind. "She did the same thing to you," Martin said. It was not a question. "Not the same scale, not the same duration," Einar paused. "But yes, the same shape." Martin thought about this. The lake he was thinking about. The lake. And the fact that it had been witnessing the same events for 30 years without having any mechanism for testifying. That it had absorbed everything. The field work, the field seasons, the early mornings on the dock when he was figuring out the theoretical architecture of the model that would become the Hella Graven framework. The mornings when he had been, briefly and completely, someone who was building something true. That all of it was in the water, in some sense, in the way that things leave impressions in the things that witness them, though water does not hold impressions in any form that human instruments can measure. "We share something," Martin said finally. "Yes." "That's not why you contacted me." "It's not the only reason," Einar said. "I contacted you because the story needed you. Because without your documentation, the grant irregularities are anomalies without an explanation. With it, they have a cause." He paused. "But I also contacted you because..." "Yes. Because I recognized what happened to you. Because I know what it costs." They sat for a while in the particular silence of two people who have been reached by the same thing from different angles. "When will you publish?" Martin said. "Assuming the documentation holds, which I believe it will. 4 to 6 weeks. There will be an editorial review. There will be a request for comment from the Institute, from Astrid Hella specifically." "She'll deny it." "Almost certainly." "And then?" "And then the documentation will speak," Einar said. "And then, with something that might have been an apology for the echo. That's usually enough." Martin nodded. He thought about the folder in his bag. He thought about 1997, and 1999, and 2005, and all the years in between in which a man had stood on a dock and thrown pebbles into a lake, and told himself that the truth did not need protecting, that good work was its own argument, that silence was not the same as absence. He pulled the folder out of his bag and set it on the table between them. The weeks that followed were, for Martin Voss, among the strangest of his life. He returned to the lake after Skarvik. He went back to the cabin and the dock and the morning ritual with the pebbles and the woodpecker in the dead birch. And he waited. It was a different kind of waiting from the kind he had done for 20 years. That kind of waiting had been passive, a waiting that hoped to be relieved of the necessity of action. This kind was active, though it looked the same from the outside. He was waiting in the knowledge that he had done what he could, and that the rest was not in his hands. And this, he discovered, was a fundamentally different physical experience than waiting had been before. Sina called on a Sunday in early September. He told her what had happened. He did it plainly, without drama, the way he told her most things. Because Sina had her mother's impatience with drama and her grandmother's sense that facts were sufficient if you chose them carefully. She listened without interrupting, which was her way of indicating seriousness. When he finished, she said, "Why didn't you tell me before?" "I didn't want it to be something you carried." "Dad." She said it with the tone of someone who has been mildly exasperated by the same thing for a long time. "I have been watching you carry this for 15 years. "I know. The notebooks in the garage," she said. "I've known what those were for a long time." He had not known she knew. He sat with that for a moment, on the dock, in the September light that had shifted from the gold of August to something cooler and more honest. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be sorry," she said. "Just tell me next time." The article was published on the 14th of October. Einar had told him the night before, a brief message. Tomorrow morning. Martin had spent the evening reading, not the documentation, not the folder, but a paper about thermal stratification that he had written in 1995, and that had never been published, because Astrid had suggested, in 1996, that it overlapped too significantly with work being done elsewhere. He had accepted this and filed it, and not thought about it in 20 years. He read it now, and found it was still good. The science was still right. The writing was precise and careful, and loved its subject in the way good scientific writing always does when it is written by someone who actually understands what they are describing. He set it down on the kitchen table. He made coffee. He sat and watched the lake in the early morning before the woodpeckers started and the day became specific. He thought about a thing Einar had told him in one of the follow-up calls they'd had over the preceding weeks, as the story was being shaped. Einar had told him that in the process of his reporting, he had spoken to 4 other researchers who had had similar experiences with the Institute, with Astrid Hella, in the period between 1998 and 2015. None of them had been willing to speak on the record. Most of them had left academia. Most of them had described the same pattern: the incremental accommodation, the slow erosion of credit, the moment when the shape of what had happened became clear, and the cost of addressing it felt higher than the cost of enduring it. All of them had been good scientists. All of them had believed, at some level, that the work would carry them regardless. None of them had been wrong about the quality of the work. All of them had been wrong about what the work could do without an advocate. Martin thought about this carefully, sitting in the early morning with his coffee and the lake going silver in the first light. He thought about what it would mean for those 4 people when the article appeared, whether it would be a relief or a reopening, whether it would feel like something finished or something began again. He thought about Astrid Hella reading it. He tried to do this without judgment, to genuinely imagine the experience of being the person who had made those choices for 20 years, who had built a career on an erasure so thorough and so gradually accomplished that perhaps, in her own accounting, she had come to believe it was not an erasure at all. Who had told the origin story so many times that perhaps it had become, in her own memory, the true story. He thought about what it would mean to have that stripped away publicly, not violently, but completely, in the way that good journalism strips things, which is to say with documentation, with precision, with the neutral weight of facts arranged so that their shape is undeniable. He did not feel satisfaction about this. He felt something quieter and harder to name. Completion, maybe. The particular feeling of a parenthesis being closed that had been open for so long its openness had seemed permanent. The article ran on the newspaper's front page, digital edition. He read it at 7 in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table. Einar had titled it, "The Missing Name," which was a good title, precise without being theatrical, honest about what had happened without performing a conclusion. The article was detailed and fair. It described the grant irregularities with the clarity of financial documentation laid out plainly. It described the attribution pattern, the papers, the presentations, the naming of the framework, with the care of a person who had understood that a story about academic credit is easy to dismiss as professional grievance unless the facts are presented with unimpeachable precision. Einar had been precise. The documentation was in the article, in summary, and the summary was careful not to exceed what the documentation supported. Martin's name was in the article. Not as a victim, it was not that kind of article, as the originator of a body of work, as the scientist who had built the theoretical architecture of the Hellegraven framework over 2 decades in a basement laboratory. The paper from 1997 was cited. The email metadata was cited. 3 of the grant applications were quoted, with the specific language about methodology attributed to the Institute highlighted against the documentation trail. Astrid Helle had provided a statement. It was 3 paragraphs long. It described the collaboration between herself and Martin Voss as one of mutual contribution, characterized the framing of authorship decisions as consistent with standard academic practice at the time, and noted that the suggestion of financial irregularity was entirely without foundation, and that the Institute would be responding formally to any inquiry from the Ministry. She did not address the email metadata. She did not address the 1997 draft. Martin read the statement twice. He thought about how it must have felt to write it, to sit down and construct a 3-paragraph defense of something that had been, when finally assembled with all its pieces visible, as clear in its shape as a building seen from the right angle. He thought about the choices that had led to that desk, that statement, that moment of being asked to explain, finally, in public, in a form that would be recorded and cited, the meaning of 31 emails over 23 years. He thought about what it cost to answer that question with the language of standard practice and mutual contribution. He thought, that is not a small cost. He was sitting in the dock when Signa called. "I read it," she said. "I know." "Dad?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear, in the background, the particular sounds of her apartment in Trondheim, her daughter, his granddaughter, doing something in a distant room that involved a great deal of enthusiasm and possibly furniture. "How do you feel?" Signa said. He thought about this honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things at 63. He felt the lake in front of him and the weight of the folder, lighter now, emptied into the world. He felt the woodpecker's absence, because the dead birch had come down in a storm the week before, and the woodpecker had not yet found a new tree that was sufficiently interesting. He felt, most immediately, the specific quality of a northern October morning on a lake that was beginning to think about winter. The water darker and more opaque than it had been in August, the air carrying in it the first intimation of something cold and final. "I feel," he said, "like something that has been very heavy for a very long time has been set down." "Is that enough?" Signa said. He thought about that. Whether it was enough. Whether the record correcting itself, the story acquiring its missing name, the documentation being assembled and published and entering the permanent, searchable world of things that had happened, whether that was enough to account for the 23 years, the 31 emails, the 1997 paper with its 2 names in the wrong order, the basement laboratory, and the field seasons and the theoretical architecture that had been built in his mind and in his notebooks and in the cold, particular water of Lake Graven before anyone else had touched it. Whether enough was even the right question. The lake was dark and still and old. It had been here longer than any of them. It had received his pebbles and his field measurements and his silences and his mornings for 30 years without keeping score, which was what water does. It receives and it releases, and it remembers in the way that water remembers, which is not through language or record, but through the patient accumulation of everything that passes through it. "I don't know," he said. "I think it might not be enough, but I think it's true. And I think that's a different question. He heard Sina breathe. He heard his granddaughter in the background, still enthusiastic, still possibly involving furniture. "Come for Christmas," Sina said. "You haven't been here for Christmas in 3 years." "I'll come," he said. The symposium at Skarvik had already released, in the weeks since the article, a statement of its own. Brief, administrative, noting that the keynote address recording would be temporarily removed from the Institute website, pending internal review of attribution standards. The ministry had confirmed, through channels Einar had followed and documented, that a formal inquiry into the grant applications was underway. These were procedural things. They would take a long time. They would result in findings that would be dry and technical, and would be read carefully by the people who read such things, and would change, in their slow institutional way, the landscape in which all of this had happened. Martin's 1995 paper, the one about thermal stratification that had never been published, that he had read on the evening before the article ran, he had sent to a journal. Not with any particular urgency, not with the feeling of rescue, with the feeling of completing something that had been left incomplete for an unreasonably long time. The paper was still good. It would be reviewed. It would either be published or not, and either way it would have existed in the form he'd sent it, which was the form he'd written it in, which was complete. He walked down to the dock in the late afternoon. The light was going. October light on the lake was different from August light, thinner, more reluctant, leaving earlier as though it had other things to get to. The water was very still. The surrounding forest had gone the specific dark amber and rust of fall, the spruce trees unchanged, but the birches that grew between them incandescent, gold against gray. He bent down and picked up a flat oval pebble from the mud at the dock's edge, the kind with one smooth face and one rough. He turned it in his fingers for a moment, the smooth side against his thumb. He thought about a boy who had grown up 200 kilometers north of this lake, the son of a fisherman who worked without complaint and believed that the work spoke for itself. He thought about a young scientist who had carried that belief into a basement laboratory and had held it for 22 years while the evidence contradicted it. Because some beliefs are not abandoned when contradicted, but only when you have something to replace them with. He thought about what he had now, at 63, in place of the belief. Not cynicism. He had been afraid for a long time that the end of that belief would be cynicism, that the world in which work spoke for itself would simply be replaced, in him, by the world in which nothing spoke for anything, and the only logic was power. But that wasn't what had happened. What had replaced the belief was something smaller and more durable. Not faith in systems, not faith in the record, not faith in institutions or practices, or the eventual self-correction of the truth. Just the knowledge that there were people like Einar Vold, who had been marked by the same hand and had found their way to their own form of honesty. Just the notebooks in the garage in Trondheim, sitting for 20 years in patient silence. Just the folder, now mostly empty and out in the world. He threw the pebble. The rings expanded outward. 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted them quietly in the still air, until they reached the reeds at the edge of the dock and dissolved there, absorbed back into the water that had been receiving everything he gave it for 30 years. 7 rings. There were always 7. He stood at the edge of the dock for a moment longer, watching the water go still again. Then he turned and walked back toward the cabin, where the light in the kitchen window was already on, yellow and warm against the darkening afternoon. A light he had left burning without thinking about it, the way you leave lights burning in places you intend to return to. The truth does not need anyone to protect it. It only needs time. This has been a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Names, characters, businesses, places, and incidents are products of imagination and do not represent any real persons or events.